There is a moment in every long life when the weight of what has been left unsaid becomes heavier than the effort it would take to finally say it. For Dick Van Dyke, comedian, dancer, singer, actor, and one of the most beloved entertainers America has ever produced, that moment did not come on a television stage or in a grand press conference. It came quietly, across decades of candid memoirs, late-night reflections, and disarmingly honest interviews in which a man who had spent his entire career making people laugh chose, at last, to let them see something else entirely, the truth. By the time Van Dyke reached his mid-90s, he had lived long enough to watch nearly everyone he loved depart before him. He had buried two of his closest friends, Carl Rayner and Norman Lay. He had lost his first wife, Margie Willett, to pancreatic cancer. He had mourned his partner of 35 years, Michelle Triola, the very next year. He had outlived a brother, colleagues, collaborators, and contemporaries until, as he himself put it with characteristic plainness, everybody I knew and worked with, there's no one left. That kind of solitude has a way of clarifying the mind. When you have outlasted nearly everyone who shared your secrets, the burden of keeping them begins to lift on its own. The secrets Dick Van Dyke carried were not the salacious kind that fill gossip columns. They were something more complicated and, in many ways, more painful than that. They were the secrets of a flawed man who had spent decades projecting uncomplicated joy to a public that badly needed it. They were the secrets of a father who admitted he probably neglected his children, of a husband who confessed to a years-long affair while his wife suffered alone on a desert ranch, of an alcoholic who smiled through his addiction for decades while the people closest to him quietly unraveled, of a man who, behind the pratfalls and the infectious grin and the impossibly limber physical comedy, was fighting some very quiet, very private wars. This is the story of those secrets, and of the extraordinary journey of one man's long, hard, ultimately triumphant reckoning with the life he actually lived, rather than the one the world thought he had. A boy from Danville, Illinois. Richard Wayne Van Dyke was born on December 13, 1925, in West Plains, Missouri, but it was Danville, Illinois, a town of roughly 30,000 people, where he grew to understand the world. His father, Loren Wayne Van Dyke, was a traveling salesman for the Sunshine Biscuit Company, a man of considerable personal charm whose work kept him on the road and away from home for long stretches. His mother, Hazel, a stenographer by trade, held the household together in his absence. The family was not wealthy. The rhythms of their domestic life were shaped by absence and retain, by financial uncertainty, and by the kind of restless longing that seems to haunt certain households. From a very young age, Dick Van Dyke understood that performance could be a bridge across loneliness. He was, by his own account, a terribly shy child. He found in school plays and community theater productions a way of connecting with people that ordinary conversation had never quite offered him. By high school, he was using humor as a tool for working through that shyness. His classmates in Danville included some remarkable talents, Donald O'Connor and Bobby Short among them, but it was Van Dyke who would eventually become the most celebrated, dragging with him into the spotlight the same Midwestern sensibility he had never been willing to fully shed. One of the things Van Dyke has been more candid about in his later years is the environment in which he grew up. When he went into therapy as an adult, confronting his own alcoholism with the help of professionals, he made a discovery that unsettled him. He was, in a very real way, repeating his father's patterns. His father, it turned out, had also been a heavy drinker, a fact Van Dyke has described as both revelatory and haunting. The condition, he came to understand, had been passed from one generation to the next as quietly and inevitably as a physical trait. For a man who had always thought of his childhood as fundamentally happy, this realization required a substantial revision. The smile that hid a struggle. The Dick Van Dyke that America came to love in the early 1960s was the embodiment of a particular post-war ideal: warm, competent, funny without cruelty, physically graceful, and seemingly incapable of genuine darkness. His television show, The Dick Van Dyke Show, which ran from 1961 to 1966, presented a version of American domestic life that was witty and aspirational. He won Emmy after Emmy. He became synonymous with a kind of effortless charisma. But behind that performance, a quiet catastrophe was unfolding in his personal life. Van Dyke had married Margie Willett on February 12, 1948, in an arrangement as unusual as it was romantic. The couple, too broke to afford a proper wedding, accepted an offer from a radio producer: get married live on air, and the show would sponsor the entire ceremony and honeymoon. Approximately 15 million listeners heard Dick Van Dyke take his vows that day, making this perhaps the most public-private moment in the history of American matrimony. It was a beginning that encapsulated something essential about the man. Even his most intimate moments had an audience. In the years that followed, Margie proved to be precisely the kind of partner that a man consumed by ambition and anxiety would need. Steady, private, fundamentally uninterested in fame. She hated Hollywood. She preferred the quiet of the desert. And in the 1960s the couple purchased a ranch in Arizona, where she could maintain the kind of grounded existence the entertainment industry had never been able to offer her. She raised their 4 children, Christian, Barry, Stacy, and Carrie, largely on her own, while her husband's star climbed higher and higher and his physical presence in the home became increasingly intermittent. Van Dyke has been remarkably forthcoming, in his later years, about the toll that his early career drive took on his family. In a candid recent interview, he acknowledged that his children were probably neglected during the years when he was grinding his way toward success, working a 5 a.m. disc jockey shift, performing in nightclubs at night, surviving on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. This was not the schedule of a man who was present for his children's childhoods in any meaningful way. In the beginning, I was raised in a family with no money, he has explained, so the whole thing was getting some money together and getting a home. The logic of poverty demands its own sacrifices, and Van Dyke made them, though not without cost. But the neglect, he has admitted, went deeper than mere business. For decades, Dick Van Dyke was an alcoholic. By his own accounting, he struggled with alcohol addiction for roughly 25 years, a span of time that covered the entirety of his greatest professional successes. The Emmy Awards, the iconic films, the beloved television appearances, all of it unfolded against the backdrop of a man quietly fighting a losing battle with a bottle. I went through that whole period of alcoholism, he has said plainly. He has described the way it affected his behavior at home, the way it seeped into the corners of family life that his public image was carefully constructed to conceal. The reckoning came in 1972. Van Dyke entered a rehabilitation clinic and committed, finally, to getting sober. It was one of the most significant decisions of his life, though it came with a twist that even he could not have predicted. On the very day he was checking out of the facility, Margie was checking in. She had developed a severe dependency on Librium, a sedative prescribed for anxiety and depression, and she had done so without her husband fully realizing the extent of her struggle. The discovery was, by any measure, devastating, not just because of what it revealed about Margie's suffering, but because of what it said about how little they had truly known each other during those years of parallel decline. As Van Dyke later wrote with characteristic wry candor, we were quite a pair, a drunk and an addict. The affair and the guilt. Sobriety, when it comes, does not automatically repair what alcohol helped destroy. In the years following his rehabilitation, Van Dyke found himself drifting away from Margie and toward someone else. Her name was Michelle Triola. She was his agent's secretary, feisty, sharp-witted, and, unlike Margie, entirely comfortable in the world of show business. They began spending time together. A friendship developed. The friendship deepened into something more. By the mid-1970s, Dick Van Dyke was involved in a full-scale extramarital affair that would last, ultimately, for 35 years. The guilt, by his own telling, was extraordinary. I was writhing in guilt, he has written and said on multiple occasions, with an openness about his own moral failure that is itself a form of reckoning. He spent years carrying the secret of the affair before he finally felt compelled to tell Margie the truth. In 1976, he confessed. The marriage, already frayed by addiction and distance and the slow erosion that comes from two people living parallel but disconnected lives, did not survive the disclosure. They separated, though the formal divorce would not be finalized until 1984. The separation was painful for everyone involved, not least for the 4 children who watched their family reorganize around a new and disorienting reality. Van Dyke went to live with Michelle Triola. Margie retreated further into the Arizona desert, finding, in the arid landscape, a kind of purpose she had never been able to locate in Hollywood. She threw herself into archaeology, of all things, uncovering and documenting an ancient Hohokam Native American village on the ranch property, an effort that culminated in a book she published in 1982. Even in her grief and her displacement, Margie Willett found a way to create something of lasting worth. Van Dyke and Michelle Triola were never married. They remained together as companions and partners for decades, through Michelle's highly publicized lawsuit against actor Lee Marvin, a legal battle over palimony that drew enormous public attention in the late 1970s, and through the quieter chapters of their shared life. When Michelle died of lung cancer in 2009, Van Dyke lost the woman with whom he had spent more than a third of a century. The loss was profound, arriving just a year after Marge's own death from pancreatic cancer. To lose two women who had defined his private life within 12 months of each other was, he has said, a grief unlike any he had known. I lost a part of myself, he said of Marge's death. The woman he had wronged, the women he had loved, the woman whose quiet endurance of his failures he could never fully repay. The public image and the private man. One of the most enduring questions about Dick Van Dyke is how he managed to maintain one of the most wholesome images in American entertainment while privately navigating such turbulent waters. The answer, perhaps, lies in the nature of his public persona itself. The pratfalls, the physical comedy, the exuberance, the wide-open smile. These were not performances in the cynical sense. Van Dyke genuinely possessed the optimism he projected. It was simply that optimism, even the most authentic kind, is not the same as happiness, and happiness is not the same as a functional private life. He has described his outlook on the world as essentially inborn, a constitutional tendency toward seeing the bright side that no amount of personal failure could entirely extinguish. I tend to look on the good side of things, he has said. I've decided people are born with a certain personality and a certain outlook, a certain perspective. This disposition, he believes, is among the central reasons he has lived as long as he has. But it also meant that for decades, he could smile at a camera, deliver a pratfall, make a nation laugh, and carry within him, simultaneously, the weight of a failing marriage, an untreated addiction, a secret affair, and the quiet knowledge that he was not being, in his private life, the man he presented to the world. He turned down some remarkable roles during those years, decisions that, in retrospect, reveal something of the protective relationship he had with his public image. He was offered the chance to play James Bond following Sean Connery's departure from the franchise. He declined, offering as his reason a self-deprecating joke about his famously exaggerated Cockney accent in Mary Poppins. Have you heard my British accent? But beneath the humor lay a real instinct, a sense that taking on a role associated with darkness and danger would have asked his audiences to accept a version of him they weren't prepared for. He also turned down a film with Cary Grant, a decision he has called one of the genuine regrets of his professional life. I regret that every day of my life, he has said. I turned Cary Grant down. I don't believe it. These missed opportunities are, in their way, minor, but they illuminate a man who spent decades navigating the space between who he was and who he appeared to be, making choices, in both his professional and personal life, that was shaped by the gap between his inner reality and his public face. Coming clean, slowly, honestly, completely. The process of Dick Van Dyke finally coming clean about the secrets he had kept was not a single dramatic confession. It was a long, gradual unfolding, a series of honest disclosures spread across years and interviews and memoirs that, taken together, form a picture of a man committed, in the final chapters of his life, to speaking truthfully about the life he had actually lived. His 2011 autobiography, My Lucky Life in and Out of Show Business, opened the door. He was candid about his drinking problem, about the affair, about the ways in which his personal life had failed to live up to the standard his public image suggested. His 2015 book, Keep Moving, went further, touching on the alcoholism, the marriages, the health struggles, and the ways in which confronting mortality had clarified his thinking about what mattered and what did not. But it was in his later interviews, as he moved through his mid-90s and toward the remarkable milestone of his 100th birthday, that the fullest picture emerged. Speaking with the particular freedom that seems to come only to those who have outlived nearly all of their contemporaries, Van Dyke addressed the things he had spent decades dancing around. He acknowledged, with genuine remorse, the harm his addiction had caused his family. He spoke about his affair not as a youthful indiscretion to be minimized, but as a moral failure he had genuinely grappled with. He talked about his father's drinking and his own, and about the therapeutic process through which he came to understand the generational transmission of self-destruction. He also spoke, and this may be the most quietly radical thing he has done, about the children he feared he had let down. In a recent interview reflecting on his life ahead of his 100th birthday, Van Dyke said plainly that his 4 children were probably neglected at some point, because I was really working hard to get out of poverty. It is the kind of honest assessment that most public figures never manage, because managing it requires the willingness to be something other than sympathetic. Van Dyke offered it without apparent self-pity and without demanding absolution. He stated it as fact, accepted it as his own, and moved on. What survived? What is remarkable about Dick Van Dyke's story? What makes it something other than simply a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition and the seductions of self-deception is what survived the wreckage of his private failures. His relationship with his children, despite the years of distance and the disruption of the divorce, appears to have healed into something genuine and enduring. Barry Van Dyke, his second son, worked alongside his father for years on Diagnosis, Murder, the television series that ran through the 1990s and gave both men a professional partnership that seemed to reconstruct, in adult terms, the father-son bond that the early years of Dick's career had made so difficult. Van Dyke has said that none of his children have complained to him about the way he raised them, a claim that, given everything he has acknowledged, suggests either remarkable forgiveness or a measure of diplomatic silence that is itself a form of love. His relationship with Arlene Silver, the makeup artist he met at the Screen Actors Guild Awards in the mid-2000s and married in 2012, has become, in his telling, the great redemptive love story of his later life. She is 4 to 6 years his junior, a fact that attracted considerable public scrutiny when they first appeared together. Van Dyke has been characteristically untroubled by the commentary. What he has said, repeatedly and with evident sincerity, is that Arlene gave him back something he feared was gone, the capacity for joy that is different from performance, the daily warmth of a shared life, the feeling of being genuinely seen and genuinely loved. She keeps me young because we sing and we dance, he has said, and she keeps me a teenager. He has credited her, without qualification, as the most important reason he has not, in his old age, become the bitter recluse that prolonged grief and prolonged solitude might otherwise have made him. The two of them post videos of themselves singing and dancing on Instagram. They perform together. They laugh together. Whatever Van Dyke carried for so many decades, the guilt, the shame, the carefully maintained distance between his public face and his private truth, appears, in these final chapters, to have been genuinely set down. The lost honesty. At the remarkable age of 100, Dick Van Dyke published a book called 100 Rules for Living to 100, An Optimist's Guide to a Happy Life. It is, in many ways, the final piece of a very long public confession, an attempt to transmit to the people who have loved him, across all these decades, not just the image of the man they thought they knew, but something of the actual truth of him. He has said that he did not expect to live past 80, that he has no clear idea what he did to reach 100, though he suspects it has something to do with stubbornly refusing, in the face of everything, to stop moving, physically, emotionally, creatively. He goes to the gym 3 days a week. He performs with his a cappella group. He appeared in a Coldplay music video at 98. He is, by every available measure, still going. But the legacy he seems most invested in now is not the one built from Emmy Awards or iconic performances or timeless films, though those are extraordinary in their own right. The legacy he seems to want, the one he is reaching toward in the honesty of his later interviews and the candor of his final books, is the legacy of a man who, having lived a long and complicated and sometimes deeply flawed life, found the courage to describe it as it actually was. "I've made it to 100, he wrote, in no small part, because I have stubbornly refused to give in to the bad stuff in life. The bad stuff, it turns out, included more than illness and loss and the ordinary sorrows of a long life. It included the bad stuff he carried inside himself, the addiction, the infidelity, the years of performance in service of an image rather than a reality. The secret he kept for decades was not a single hidden fact but something more diffuse and more human, the distance between who he was and who he appeared to be, and the long, slow, quietly courageous work of closing that distance before the final curtain came down. For anyone who grew up watching Dick Van Dyke dance across a television screen, or float above London rooftops, or tumble over a footstool with the precision of a born clown, the revelation of what was happening behind those performances does not diminish the joy they gave. If anything, it deepens it. Joy is not less valuable for being hard-won. Laughter is not less real for being offered by someone who is also, quietly, in pain. Dick Van Dyke spent a lifetime making people believe everything was fine. In the end, the most generous thing he did was tell them the truth.